I was standing in the kitchen, swirling the last of my whiskey in a glass, when I saw him again, our son, Ben, sneakily glancing at his phone. It was past midnight, and the house was silent, but that faint glow lit up the corner where he sat, hunched over, face bathed in the blue light. "Ben," I called out softly, "what are you still doing up?" He looked up, startled, eyes wide as he clutched his phone. "Nothing, Dad, just checking something for school," he stammered, quickly turning off the screen. I didn't think much of it at first. Kids these days are glued to their screens, it's almost a rite of passage. But something about his reaction didn't sit right with me. His face was flushed, his voice uneven, too quick to defend. I placed my glass down and walked over to him. "Show me," I said, my voice firm but calm. "Dad, really," he began, but I held up my hand, not wanting to turn this into a debate. "Just show me the phone, Ben." Reluctantly, he handed it over, and I scrolled through the apps. Nothing out of the ordinary at first, until I opened his text messages. That's when everything changed. My heart stopped as I saw her name, Rachel, my wife. Her messages, buried between the usual banter with school friends, stood out like a dagger waiting to be pulled out. I couldn't help but scroll further, piecing together the thread of their conversation. Rachel and Dan, her personal trainer, had been texting regularly. But these weren't just about fitness tips or scheduling. They were intimate. It felt like someone had reached inside my chest and squeezed, twisting my insides into a knot. The messages were casual enough on the surface, but it was the tone, the emojis, the late-night timing that told me everything I needed to know. Ben, sensing the shift in my expression, spoke up nervously. "Dad, I didn't mean to. I just saw the texts pop up when Mom was using my phone to make a call. I wasn't snooping, I swear." I put the phone down on the table, my mind spinning. Rachel, my Rachel, was having an affair with Dan, the man I'd paid to help her stay in shape, the man I had trusted. It was absurd. I felt like an idiot, completely blindsided by the one person I thought I could rely on. "Go to bed, Ben," I said, my voice low, steady, betraying none of the rage simmering beneath the surface. "Dad, I'm sorry, I didn't know what to do." I looked at him, my chest tightening as I tried to keep my emotions in check. "It's not your fault, Ben. Just go to bed." He hesitated but then shuffled off, casting worried glances over his shoulder. Once he was gone, the silence of the house pressed down on me, suffocating. I picked up my glass again, though the whiskey had lost its bite. Every sip felt hollow. My eyes kept drifting back to the phone, to the betrayal written in a series of texts that now played over and over in my mind. I sat there for what felt like hours, the reality of it all crashing over me in waves. Rachel wasn't home yet. She'd told me she had an evening session with Dan, a training session. Of course. Now I knew better. My fists clenched involuntarily, a sickening blend of rage and humiliation coursing through me. But this wasn't the time to act impulsively. No, I needed to be smart about this. I needed to make sure both Rachel and Dan felt the weight of what they'd done. The phone buzzed, and I glanced at the screen. Another message from Dan, this one more explicit than the others. My blood boiled, but a grim smile spread across my face as an idea started to form in the back of my mind. If Rachel and Dan thought they could get away with this, they were sorely mistaken. This was just the beginning. The next morning, the house felt eerily normal, like nothing had changed. The sun filtered through the blinds, casting warm light on the kitchen table where Rachel sat, sipping her coffee. She smiled at me, the same smile I had seen 1,000 times before, but now it felt hollow, like a mask hiding the truth. I could barely look at her without feeling a wave of disgust. I said nothing. I played along, letting her believe everything was fine. My son, Ben, sat across from her, his eyes flicking nervously between us. I hadn't told Rachel about the messages he showed me, and I wasn't going to. This was between me and her and Dan. "Busy day today?" I asked casually, my voice steady despite the anger bubbling just beneath the surface. "Yeah, a couple of meetings, then I've got a session with Dan later," she said without missing a beat. "Of course, you do," I thought. But I just nodded, forcing a tight smile. Inside, my mind was already spinning with plans. I couldn't let her know what I discovered, not yet. I needed time to get everything in place, to make sure when I struck, it would be devastating. I left for work, though I barely registered anything on the drive. My thoughts were consumed by her betrayal, and the rage inside me only grew stronger the more I thought about it. I wasn't going to confront Rachel directly. That would be too easy. I needed to hit her, and Dan, where it would hurt the most. At the office, I made a few discreet phone calls. I knew people, the right people. The kind of people who could spread rumors, who could make life difficult for someone in Dan's position. It didn't take long to plant the seeds of what would soon become a full-blown scandal. I arranged for a few influential people, clients, business owners, even a couple of reporters, to attend one of Dan's training sessions. I wanted them there when the fallout started. I wanted them to see the man behind the mask, the fraud who had slept with another man's wife. As I set the plan in motion, I felt an unsettling calm. This wasn't about revenge for revenge's sake. This was about taking back control and making sure Dan and Rachel understood the weight of their actions. I would make sure they paid for what they did. And when they did, it would be too late for either of them to undo the damage. The following week felt like a slow march toward an inevitable climax. Rachel continued with her routine, blissfully unaware that her world was about to fall apart. I watched her closely, noticing every little detail. The way she would check her phone with a slight smile when she thought I wasn't looking, the way her eyes lit up when she talked about her training sessions. Each small action fueled the fire inside me. I played the part of the unsuspecting husband perfectly. I smiled when I needed to, made small talk over dinner, and even kissed her goodnight. But every moment was a performance. Inside, I was counting down the days until everything would come crashing down. It was a Wednesday when I struck the first blow. That evening, Dan had a group training session at the gym. I had timed everything perfectly. Several of the people I'd contacted, some of the most influential clients in town, were scheduled to attend. I had also arranged for a well-connected friend of mine, someone with a particular interest in gossip, to be there as well. She'd spread the rumors like wildfire. I parked outside the gym, sitting in my car with my phone in hand, waiting for the right moment. My hands shook slightly, the anticipation getting to me. I wasn't just exposing the affair, I was dismantling everything Dan had worked for. Then, the moment arrived. I sent the messages, the screenshots of Rachel and Dan's texts, the ones I had found on my son's phone. Each one painted a clear picture of their affair, the late-night meetups, the flirty exchanges. I sent them to every person attending the session that evening. One by one, their phones buzzed with the proof of Dan's betrayal. I stayed outside, watching as people began to leave the gym early, their faces a mix of disgust and disbelief. A few exchanged words in hushed tones, some stormed off angrily, and others stayed just long enough to shoot Dan accusatory glares before disappearing. Dan must have noticed the shift in the room because, after about 20 minutes, he came outside. He looked around, confused, his phone in hand as he scrolled through the messages. I could see the panic spreading across his face as he realized what had just happened. He had no idea I was sitting in the car, watching his world fall apart. It was almost too easy. Rachel came home late that night, probably having spent extra time comforting Dan after his disastrous session. She didn't say much as she walked in, just muttered something about a tough day and went straight to bed. I smiled to myself. This was just the beginning. The next few days were chaotic, though Rachel remained oblivious to the storm brewing around her. She left for her training sessions as usual, smiling as she kissed me goodbye in the morning. I could hardly stomach it. Every time she left, it felt like another twist of the knife. Meanwhile, Dan's career was starting to crumble. I heard through the grapevine that his clients had begun canceling sessions, claiming they no longer felt comfortable working with him. The rumors I had seeded were spreading fast, poisoning his reputation in the fitness community. I made sure to keep my ear to the ground, listening as more and more people distanced themselves from him. Some of my contacts in local gyms told me they had heard whispers of Dan being unprofessional, of him getting involved with a client. No one knew the full story yet, but it didn't matter. The damage was done. One afternoon, I was in the living room when Rachel came home earlier than expected. Her face was pale, her usual confident smile replaced with an anxious frown. She dropped her gym bag by the door and sat down across from me, avoiding my gaze. I don't know what's going on," she said, her voice shaky. "Dan's been acting strange. His clients are leaving him, and there's all this talk going around about him being involved with someone. He's completely freaked out." I could barely contain my satisfaction. Instead, I forced a look of mild concern, feigning ignorance. Really? That's odd. Maybe it's just some misunderstanding, I said, sipping my coffee to hide the smirk threatening to creep across my face. Rachel nodded, her mind clearly elsewhere. She wasn't stupid, she had to be putting pieces together. But she hadn't yet made the connection that I was behind the unraveling of Dan's life. Not yet, at least. I'm sure it'll blow over, I added casually. These things usually do. But we both knew better. This wasn't going to blow over, it was going to explode. And when it did, Rachel would be right in the middle of it. That evening, I watched her closely as we sat through dinner. She barely touched her food, her mind clearly racing. I wondered if she was starting to regret the affair. Maybe she realized now that Dan wasn't worth it, that this stupid fling was about to ruin everything. But even if she did, it was too late. The life she had built with me was crumbling, and she hadn't even noticed the cracks until now. 2 days later, it all came crashing down. It was a Friday evening. Rachel was supposed to meet Dan for another training session, but she came home earlier than expected, her face flushed with anger and panic. I was sitting in the living room when she stormed in, throwing her bag down and pacing back and forth. "Michael," she snapped, her voice tight, "I need to talk to you." I looked up, playing dumb. "What's wrong?" She stopped, her hands trembling as she ran them through her hair. "Dan's losing all his clients. There's something going on. People are talking about him, saying he's been inappropriate with someone. I don't know how, but it's all connected to me." I set down my book, watching her unravel before my eyes. This was it, the moment I had been waiting for. "I think someone knows, Michael, about me and Dan. People are talking. It's only a matter of time before everyone finds out," she continued, her voice breaking. I leaned back, crossing my arms. "Maybe they already have." Rachel froze, her eyes widening as she finally looked at me, really looked at me. It was as if she were seeing me for the first time since this whole thing began. What do you mean?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. I stood up slowly, taking my time as I walked over to her. "I mean, maybe someone has already made sure the truth is out there. Maybe someone's tired of being lied to. Maybe someone is tired of watching his wife sneak around behind his back with her personal trainer." Her face turned pale, and she stumbled back, collapsing onto the couch. You know?" I nodded, the satisfaction of seeing her squirm fueling my calm exterior. "I've known for a while, Rachel. I've seen the messages. I know everything." She was silent for a moment, her hands shaking as she buried her face in them. "Michael, I'm so sorry. It was a mistake. I wasn't thinking." No, I interrupted, my voice cold. "Don't try to explain it away. This wasn't a mistake, Rachel. This was a choice. You chose to betray me. You chose to put our family at risk for some stupid fling with a guy who's losing everything right now because of you." Tears welled up in her eyes, but I wasn't moved. "Not anymore. I didn't think it would get this far," she whispered, her voice broken. "Well, it has. And now you're going to face the consequences." She looked up at me, fear and regret written all over her face. "What are you going to do?" I smiled grimly. "I've already done it, Rachel. Dan's career is over. He's finished. And you're going to have to live with what you've done." She tried to reach for my hand, but I stepped back, shaking my head. "It's too late for that. You've made your bed. Now you're going to lie in it." Rachel broke down, sobbing into her hands as I watched her from across the room. Feeling nothing but a cold satisfaction. She had destroyed our marriage, and now she was watching her world collapse around her. But this wasn't the end. Not yet. There was still more to come. The next few days were a blur of tension and silence. Rachel walked around the house like a ghost, her eyes red and puffy from crying, barely able to look me in the eye. I could tell she wanted to talk, to beg for forgiveness, but I wasn't interested in hearing any more of her excuses. Every time I looked at her, I saw Dan, and it made my stomach turn. I didn't say much either. I didn't need to. The damage had already been done, and there was no fixing this. We were just going through the motions, pretending we still had some semblance of normalcy for Ben's sake, but the cracks in our lives were too big to hide. At night, I would lie awake, staring at the ceiling, replaying every moment of our marriage in my head. How had we gotten here? When did everything start to fall apart? The answers didn't matter anymore. What mattered was the outcome, and the outcome was clear. My wife had chosen someone else, and she was about to lose everything because of it. One afternoon, while I was at work, I received a call from one of my contacts at the gym. Dan had officially been let go. The owner couldn't afford to keep him on staff after the scandal broke. Too many clients had left, and Dan's reputation was in shambles. Good. That was exactly what I wanted. Later that evening, Rachel tried to talk to me again. She approached me cautiously, like someone approaching a wild animal they were afraid might bite. Michael, she started, her voice soft, can we please talk about this? I know what I did was wrong, but we need to find a way to move forward. For Ben. For us. I didn't respond right away. I just looked at her, wondering if she actually believed that we could ever go back to the way things were. How could she expect that after what she had done? There is no moving forward, Rachel, I said finally. My voice cold and detached. Not after this. She looked down, biting her lip, and I could see the desperation in her eyes. But we can't just throw everything away. We've built a life together. Doesn't that mean anything? I scoffed. It meant something, Rachel. Before you decided to sleep with Dan. Now it means nothing. Her face crumpled, but I didn't feel anything. No sympathy, no pity. This was her fault, and she knew it. Do you think Ben's going to respect you after he finds out what you've done? I asked, my words hitting her like a slap in the face. Do you think your colleagues will look at you the same way when this gets out? You've destroyed everything. Tears welled up in her eyes, but I didn't relent. You made your choice, Rachel. Now you're going to live with the consequences. Rachel's breakdown was inevitable. She tried to hold it together for a while, but the pressure was too much. Losing Dan, and knowing that her secret was on the verge of being exposed, it all weighed on her. Crushing her bit by bit. I could see the toll it was taking on her at work too. She started coming home later, her energy drained, her eyes sunken. She was struggling to keep up appearances, to hold on to the last bits of her professional reputation before it all came crashing down. But I wasn't done yet. I still had one more move to make. Dan may have been out of a job, but that wasn't enough for me. I wanted Rachel to feel the full weight of what she had done. I wanted her to lose everything. One morning, while she was at work, I sent the final piece of evidence to her boss, an anonymous email containing the screenshots of her messages with Dan. It was all laid out in black and white, the affair, the lies, the deceit. Her boss wouldn't be able to ignore it. By the time Rachel came home that evening, I knew the bomb had already gone off. She walked in slowly, her face pale, her hands shaking as she dropped her purse on the counter. For a moment, she just stood there, staring at the floor. As if trying to gather the strength to speak. They know, she whispered, her voice barely audible. I got called into a meeting today. They showed me the messages. Someone sent them to my boss. I leaned back, watching her unravel once again. What did they say? They've put me on leave, she said, her voice breaking. They're going to investigate. I could lose my job, Michael. You should have thought about that before you slept with Dan, I interrupted. My voice cold, her knees buckled, and she collapsed onto the couch, sobbing into her hands. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. I never wanted this. I didn't mean for it to go this far. I just stood there, arms crossed, watching her fall apart. This was the moment I had been waiting for, the moment when she realized there was no coming back from this. I've already contacted a lawyer, I said, my voice steady. I'm filing for divorce. I'll be seeking full custody of Ben. Rachel looked up at me. Her tear-streaked face filled with disbelief. Michael, please, don't do this. We can fix this. I'll do anything. But her pleading meant nothing to me now. I had already made up my mind. This is what you deserve, I said simply. She broke down completely, sobbing uncontrollably as I walked out of the room. Her world was falling apart, and I was the one who had made it happen. It was over. For her. For us. There was no going back. The day after I told Rachel I was filing for divorce, I wasted no time putting everything into motion. I hired the best lawyer in town, someone with a reputation for ruthlessly winning custody cases. Ben was mine, and I wasn't going to let Rachel keep any part of the life she had destroyed. Rachel, on the other hand, was in a state of complete shock. She was barely functional. Her job was slipping through her fingers, and now the thought of losing her son sent her spiraling even deeper into despair. I almost felt sorry for her, watching her try to hold onto the shreds of our lives while everything else slipped away. Almost, but that sympathy was fleeting. Every time I remembered the affair, the humiliation she put me through, I hardened myself against any pity I might have felt. This wasn't my fault. She had made her choice. The weeks that followed were filled with court dates, paperwork, and endless meetings with lawyers. Rachel was trying to fight back, of course. She wanted to keep Ben, arguing that I was being vengeful, that I was punishing her for the affair. And she was right. I was. But I wasn't going to let her win. During one of our hearings, she finally broke down on the stand. I watched her crumble as she pleaded with the judge, her voice shaking, tears streaming down her face. "I know I made a mistake," she said, her voice trembling. "But I love my son. He's my whole world. Please, don't take him away from me." Her lawyer tried to make her look like the victim, painting me as the cold, calculating husband out for revenge. But it didn't matter. I had the upper hand, and Rachel's crumbling personal life made her look unstable. The affair with Dan had poisoned her image beyond repair. After the hearing, we sat in separate corners of the courtroom. Rachel didn't look at me, but I could see the toll this was taking on her. She was losing, and she knew it. By the time the judge ruled in my favor, awarding me full custody of Ben, Rachel was a shadow of the woman she used to be. The proud, confident woman who had once walked into this house with her head held high was gone. In her place was someone broken, someone who had lost everything. The irony was almost poetic. She had destroyed our family with her choices, and now she had lost it all. Her job, her lover, and now her son. But I wasn't done yet. The final step in my plan came sooner than expected. With Ben now in my custody, I was free to focus on the last part of Rachel's downfall, her reputation. After the divorce became public, word of Rachel's affair with Dan spread like wildfire through her workplace and our social circles. People who once admired her began to distance themselves. Whispers and judgment following her wherever she went. At first, Rachel tried to keep her head down, avoiding the gossip and throwing herself into her work. But that didn't last long. Her suspension turned into an investigation, and soon she was under fire from her colleagues as well. The affair with Dan wasn't something they could easily overlook, not when it affected the company's image. One evening, I received an anonymous tip that the higher-ups at her firm were considering terminating her employment. They didn't want to be associated with someone involved in such a public scandal. I didn't know who the tip came from, but I didn't care. It was exactly what I had been waiting for. Rachel's professional reputation had been one of the few things she had left. Without her job, without her career, there would be nothing left for her to cling to. And that's exactly what happened. 2 weeks later, I came home from work to find a letter from Rachel on the kitchen counter. It was short, almost curt in its tone. But the words were enough to show me how far she had fallen. "Michael, I'm leaving town. I've lost my job. I've lost everything. I can't stay here anymore, not like this. I hope you're happy with what you've done. Take care of Ben." No signature. No goodbye. Just those final, bitter words. I folded the letter and tucked it into my pocket, a strange sense of closure settling over me. This was it. Rachel was gone. She had lost her job, her lover, her son, and now her place in this town. She had no reason to stay. I looked around the house, feeling a strange sense of peace for the first time in months. Ben was with my parents for the weekend, and I had the house to myself. As I sat down on the couch, the silence around me felt different. It wasn't the cold, tense silence of the past few months. This was the calm after the storm. Everything had settled, and for the first time in what felt like forever, I could breathe. I knew I should feel victorious. I had won. Rachel was out of our lives. And I had full custody of Ben. Dan's career was in ruins, and Rachel's reputation was destroyed. But as I sat there, staring at the empty space where Rachel's things used to be, I couldn't help but wonder if I had truly won anything at all. The house was too quiet without Ben, even if it was just for the weekend. I had gotten used to his laughter, the sounds of his toys scattered across the living room, and the constant chatter about school, sports, or his latest obsession. Without him, the silence was unsettling. I stood by the window, looking out at the front yard. The neighborhood was peaceful, and the sunset painted the sky in soft shades of orange and pink. But inside, I felt nothing. No joy, no relief, no satisfaction. Just emptiness. Rachel had been gone for a week now, and I hadn't heard a word from her. I assumed she was staying with friends or maybe at a hotel, though I didn't really care where she ended up. She'd made her choices, and now she had to live with them. But despite everything I had done, despite winning the custody battle, securing Ben, and pushing Rachel out of our lives, the victory felt hollow. I had thought that once she was gone, I'd feel some sense of closure, some kind of peace that would tell me it had all been worth it. But instead, I was left with this gnawing feeling that something was missing. I had spent so long focused on revenge, on making sure Rachel paid for what she did, that I hadn't thought about what would come after. I had been so consumed by anger that I hadn't considered what my life would look like once it was all over. Now that it was, I wasn't sure what to do. I poured myself a glass of whiskey, hoping the burn would dull the edges of my thoughts, but it didn't. The memories of everything that had happened were still fresh in my mind: the betrayal, the humiliation, the anger. I had played it all out perfectly, step by step, and now that it was done, there was nothing left to focus on but the emptiness. I took another sip and stared at the wall. I had gotten rid of Rachel, but what had I really won? Ben would be back tomorrow, and I knew I had to be strong for him. I had to be the father he needed, the stable figure in his life. But I couldn't shake the feeling that in all my efforts to destroy Rachel, I had lost something of myself along the way. The next morning, I found a letter waiting for me in the mailbox. It was from Rachel. The envelope was plain, her handwriting familiar but shaky, as if she had written it in a hurry or under stress. I sat down at the kitchen table, staring at it for a few moments before opening it. I wasn't sure what I expected: an apology, more bitterness, maybe even a desperate plea for another chance. But what I found was different. Michael, I don't know where to begin. Part of me wants to explain myself, to tell you why things happened the way they did, but I know it doesn't matter anymore. The truth is, I made a mistake. A huge, unforgivable mistake. And now I've lost everything because of it. I've spent the last few days thinking about what you said, about how there's no moving forward from this. And I think you're right. There's no going back to the way things were, no fixing what I broke. But that doesn't make this any easier. Losing Ben is the hardest part. I know you'll take care of him. You've always been a good father, and I don't doubt for a second that he'll be safe and loved with you. But I can't help but feel like I've failed him too. He deserves better than what I gave him. He deserves a mother who didn't ruin everything. I'm leaving town, as I told you before. I can't stay here, not with everything that's happened. I need to start over somewhere else, away from the memories, away from the shame. I don't expect you to care, but I thought you should know. I don't know what the future holds for me, but I hope one day you can forgive me. Not for me, but for Ben's sake. He'll ask about me one day, and I don't want him to grow up hating me. I've made enough mistakes already. Take care of him, Michael. He's all that matters now. Rachel. I set the letter down and let out a long breath. I hadn't expected her to reach out again, especially not like this. Her words felt different this time, not the desperate pleas of someone trying to save themselves, but the honest admission of someone who knew they had lost. For the first time in months, I felt something other than anger toward her. I wasn't sure if it was pity or sadness or maybe just exhaustion. But I knew one thing for certain: she was right. Ben was all that mattered now. As much as I had wanted to punish Rachel, as much as I had wanted her to suffer for what she did, I couldn't let that be the story Ben grew up with. He didn't need to know the details of her betrayal, at least not now. He needed stability, love, and a life without the bitterness that had consumed us both. I folded the letter and tucked it into the drawer with the rest of the paperwork from the divorce. I wasn't sure what I'd do with it yet. But for now, it didn't matter. What mattered was the future, Ben's future. And as much as I wanted to forget everything Rachel had done, I couldn't ignore the part of me that still wanted to protect her, if only for our son's sake. I took a deep breath and walked over to the window, looking out at the yard where Ben's toys were scattered across the grass. The past was behind us now, and for the first time in a long time, I felt like I could see a path forward. It wasn't the victory I had imagined. But maybe, just maybe, it was enough. A few weeks after Rachel left town, Ben began to ask questions. It was inevitable, really. He was only 10, but he was smart enough to know something wasn't right. The first few days, he'd ask casually where his mom was, assuming she was just away for work or visiting someone. But as time passed, the excuses I gave him, she's busy, she's out of town for a while, didn't satisfy him anymore. One evening, after dinner, he finally confronted me. We were sitting in the living room watching one of his favorite shows when he turned to me and asked, "Dad, why isn't Mom coming home?" I felt the weight of his question immediately. This was the moment I had been dreading, the moment when I would have to tell my son the truth, or at least a version of it that he could understand. I couldn't lie to him forever, but I also didn't want to hurt him with the ugly details. I turned off the TV and faced him, trying to find the right words. Ben, I began carefully, your mom made some choices that weren't good for our family. She decided to leave for a while because she thought it was best. He looked at me, confused. What kind of choices? I hesitated. How much should I tell him? How much did he need to know? I didn't want to poison his image of Rachel, but I couldn't protect him from the truth forever. Your mom and we had some problems, Ben. Problems that we couldn't fix. She hurt me, and I hurt her back. And now we've decided it's better for us to live apart. Ben's face scrunched in frustration. Did you guys fight? Is that why she's gone? I sighed, realizing that there was no easy way to explain this. Yes, we fought, but it's more complicated than that. Sometimes, even when people love each other, they make mistakes that can't be undone. That's what happened with your mom and me. He was quiet for a moment, processing everything. Then, he asked the question I had been fearing most. Does mom still love me? I swallowed hard, feeling a lump rise in my throat. This was the one question I couldn't answer with certainty, but I knew what I had to say. Yes, Ben, your mom loves you very much. She's going through some hard things right now, but that doesn't change how she feels about you. He looked down at his hands, clearly upset but trying to be brave. Will I see her again? I reached out and put my hand on his shoulder. I don't know when, Ben. But I promise, when she's ready, she'll want to see you. And I'll make sure you do. He nodded, still looking down. And I could see the tears welling up in his eyes. I wanted to tell him everything would be okay, but I wasn't sure it would be. All I could do was be there for him, to help him through the pain I knew was coming. Later that night, after he went to bed, I sat on the couch and stared at the empty spot where Rachel used to sit. I had wanted her out of our lives so badly, but now that she was gone, I couldn't help but feel like Ben had been the one to pay the highest price. As the weeks passed, I found myself thinking more and more about Rachel's letter. I had tried to push it out of my mind, to focus on rebuilding my life with Ben, but her words lingered. She had said she hoped one day I could forgive her, not for her sake, but for Ben's. At the time, I hadn't really processed what that meant. Forgiveness had seemed impossible. But now, watching Ben struggle with the absence of his mother, I started to wonder if holding on to my anger was hurting him more than it was helping me. I had spent so much time plotting Rachel's downfall, making sure she lost everything, that I hadn't thought about what it would do to our son. One evening, I was going through some old photo albums, trying to organize them. There were pictures of Rachel and me when we first got married, smiling and full of hope. Then there were pictures of Ben as a baby, Rachel holding him with a proud smile. The kind of smile that made me realize how much she had loved him, despite everything that had happened between us. I couldn't deny that Rachel had been a good mother to Ben before the affair. She had been there for him, loved him, cared for him. And as much as I wanted to hate her for what she did to me, I couldn't ignore that part of her. The part that still cared about our son, the part that still deserved to be in his life. That night, I made a decision. I couldn't erase what had happened, and I couldn't pretend that Rachel and I would ever be the same. But for Ben's sake, I had to let go of the need for revenge. He needed his mother in his life, and I needed to find a way to make that happen, even if it meant swallowing my pride. The next day, I reached out to Rachel. I wasn't sure if she would respond, or if she even wanted to hear from me after everything that had gone down. But I sent her a message anyway, asking if she wanted to talk about Ben. To my surprise, she replied within a few hours. Her response was brief, just a simple, "Yes, I'd like that," but it was enough to start a conversation. Over the next few days, we exchanged emails, slowly working out a plan for how she could stay involved in Ben's life, even if she wasn't physically here. It wasn't easy. There was still a lot of pain between us, and trust was a long way off. But for the first time in months, I felt like I was doing something right. Not for me, not for Rachel, but for Ben. In the end, that was all that mattered. The first time Ben spoke to Rachel after she left, I wasn't sure how it would go. I had arranged a video call between them, and I could tell Ben was both excited and nervous. He missed her, even if he didn't fully understand why she was gone. I hadn't told him the details. He didn't need to know about the affair or the ugly fallout between us. He just needed to reconnect with his mom. When the screen flickered to life and Rachel's face appeared, I saw a mixture of relief and sadness wash over her. She smiled softly, trying to hold herself together, but I could see the strain. This wasn't the confident, composed woman I had known for so many years. She was different now. humbled by the choices she'd made and the consequences she had to live with. "Hi, Mom," Ben said, his voice quieter than usual. "Hey, sweetheart," she replied, her voice cracking slightly. "I've missed you so much." They talked for a while, mostly about little things: school, friends, his favorite TV shows. It was a normal conversation, but I could feel the weight behind every word. Ben was still processing everything that had happened, and Rachel was doing her best to pretend that everything was fine. Though I could tell it was breaking her heart to be so far away. I watched from the doorway, giving them space but staying close enough in case Ben needed me. Part of me still resented Rachel for everything she had done, but seeing her with our son, I realized how much she truly loved him. Despite all her mistakes, she was trying to make things right in the only way she knew how. After the call ended, Ben turned to me with a look of quiet satisfaction. "She said she's going to call me every week now," he said, his face lighting up with hope. "That's great, buddy," I replied, ruffling his hair. "I'm glad you got to talk." As the weeks went by, Rachel made good on her promise. She called Ben regularly, and their relationship slowly began to rebuild. It wasn't the same as before, but it was something, and that was enough for now. I made sure to keep my distance, not wanting to interfere, but I couldn't help feeling a strange sense of relief. Rachel was still a part of Ben's life, and in some way, that made things feel more balanced. One afternoon, after Ben got off the phone with his mom, he asked me something that caught me off guard. "Dad, do you still hate Mom?" I paused, unsure of how to answer. I didn't hate her anymore, not the way I once did. The anger had burned so hot for so long, but now it was like the embers of a fire that had finally died out. I didn't feel the same rage, the same need for revenge. I just felt tired. "I don't hate her, Ben," I said after a moment. "I was angry for a long time, and we both made mistakes. But your mom still loves you, and that's what's important." He seemed to think about that for a moment, then nodded. "I'm glad you don't hate her," he said quietly. "I want things to be okay again." I smiled, even though I knew things would never be the way they were before. But maybe that wasn't such a bad thing. "We'll figure it out," I told him. "It's going to be different, but we'll make it work." Later that evening, I found myself sitting outside on the porch, watching the sunset over the neighborhood. The sky was streaked with shades of pink and orange, casting a warm glow over everything. For the first time in months, I felt a sense of peace. I had spent so much time being consumed by what Rachel had done, letting the anger define every decision I made. But now, as I looked toward the future, I realized that I didn't want to be stuck in the past anymore. Rachel had made her mistakes, and I had made mine. But holding on to all that resentment wasn't helping anyone, least of all Ben. Forgiveness wasn't about letting Rachel off the hook. It was about giving myself, and Ben, a chance to move forward. To stop letting the pain of the past control our future. I took a deep breath and let the cool evening air fill my lungs. It wasn't perfect. It wasn't the life I had imagined for us. But it was a new beginning. And for the first time, I felt ready to embrace it. A few months after Rachel's departure, life had finally settled into a new rhythm. Ben had adjusted better than I expected. His weekly calls with Rachel became a regular part of our routine, and while things between us weren't perfect, they were functional. I had accepted that this new reality wasn't about winning or losing anymore, it was about finding peace. One evening, I was picking up Ben from a basketball game. He'd become more involved in sports lately, and I was glad to see him focusing on something positive. As we drove home, Ben turned to me with a smile. "Dad, guess what?" he said excitedly. "What's up, buddy?" "Coach said I might make the starting lineup next season." His face lit up with pride, and I couldn't help but smile back. This was the kind of joy I wanted for him, simple, innocent, free from the chaos of everything that had happened between Rachel and me. "That's awesome, Ben. I'm really proud of you," I said, glancing over at him. He beamed, and I could see how much he was growing. It was moments like this that reminded me of what truly mattered. As we pulled into the driveway, I noticed a car parked a little way down the street. At first, I didn't think much of it, but something about the way the driver sat there caught my attention. I didn't recognize the car, and it had been there for a few minutes, idling quietly. "Ben, go on inside," I said, trying not to make it seem like a big deal. He grabbed his bag and ran into the house, leaving me standing in the driveway. I walked over to the car, cautious but not wanting to jump to conclusions. As I got closer, the window rolled down, and I was met with a face I hadn't seen in years. It was Dan. I stood there, frozen for a moment, my mind trying to catch up. What was he doing here? Why now? Michael, Dan said, his voice calm but heavy with unspoken words. Can we talk? I hadn't seen Dan since everything blew up, since I had made sure his career and reputation were left in ruins. The sight of him stirred something deep inside me, a mix of old anger and a strange curiosity. I wanted to turn around and walk away, but something held me in place. I crossed my arms and kept my distance. What do you want? He sighed, rubbing his temples. I'm not here to cause trouble. I just wanted to say, I'm sorry. I narrowed my eyes, unsure of his intentions. Sorry? For what, exactly? For screwing my wife? For ruining my family? Dan flinched, but he didn't back down. I deserve that, he said quietly. I'm not here to make excuses. I've been carrying this guilt for a long time, and I needed to own up to what I did. I stared at him, trying to gauge whether his apology was genuine. It had been months since I'd last thought of him as anything more than a name associated with pain and betrayal. But seeing him now, humbled, broken, was strangely disarming. He continued, I lost everything after what happened. My business, my clients, my reputation, it's all gone. But I've had time to think, and I realized that I hurt more people than just Rachel. I hurt you. And for that, I'm truly sorry. I didn't say anything for a while. The silence hung in the air between us, thick with tension. Part of me wanted to lash out, to remind him of everything I had lost because of him. But another part of me, one I hadn't acknowledged until now, felt something else. Closure. Maybe it was time to stop carrying this anger, to stop letting it control me. Maybe forgiveness wasn't about him at all, but about freeing myself from the past. I appreciate you saying that, I finally said, my voice steady but firm. But this doesn't change what happened. I know, Dan replied. And I don't expect it to. I just wanted you to know that I'm sorry. That's all. I nodded, feeling a strange sense of relief. I didn't forgive him, not entirely. But his apology marked the end of a chapter I hadn't realized I was still living in. There was no more room for him in my life, and I was okay with that. Without another word, Dan nodded, rolled up the window, and drove away. I stood there in the quiet street, watching the taillights fade into the distance. For the first time in a long while, I didn't feel the familiar weight of anger on my shoulders. It was as if something had lifted, something that had been holding me down. I turned and walked back into the house. Ben was sitting at the kitchen table, drawing something in his notebook. He looked up and grinned when he saw me. Dad, I'm hungry. Can we order pizza? I laughed. Yeah, let's do it. As I placed the order and sat down with Ben, I realized how far I had come. The anger, the need for revenge, it was all behind me now. Rachel's betrayal had once defined my life, but it didn't anymore. I had Ben, and I had the future we were building together. And that was all I needed. In this final chapter, Michael confronts Dan, the man at the center of the affair, and is offered an apology that, while not completely resolving the past, allows Michael to find a sense of closure. By letting go of his anger and focusing on his life with Ben, Michael takes the final step toward healing and embracing his new reality.